Welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. My name is Amber Larkins, published photographer, storytelling expert, visual artist, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach. This podcast was born from one question: how do I get inspiring stories of triumph out to the people who need to hear them the most? Come with me, enter my world, where lives are getting changed, heroes are getting developed, and greatness is being achieved. Hello and welcome to another episode of Through the Trauma podcast. I am Amber Larkins, your host, and today I have with me Miss Valerie Johns. Now, she is a veteran psychotherapist whose new book, Ashes in the Milk, tells her own healing story, including memories that go back to infancy. She's been practicing various forms of soul retrieval since the 1980s, and she is a dream tender who knows grief and trauma from the inside out. Valerie, I'm so excited to have you. I always love interviewing doctors and therapists because you bring a wealth of knowledge to my audience. So thank you for giving us your time today and be willing to share with us your story.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Is there anything, first of all, that I've left out or anything else you want my audience to know specifically about you?
No, I think it'll come out pretty clearly just through telling of my story.
So do you want to jump into your story?
Happy to. I've been a poet since I was 8 years old because I needed to do something creative with my incredibly busy mind. And there's not a lot of work for poets in the world. And in my early 30s, I went back to college to finish school, and I was sure that I was going to get an MFA, be a poet in a university setting. And it didn't open up for me that way. And I got on my knees and I said to the universe, what would you have me do? And as loud as a loudspeaker at an airport calling a flight, it said, call the Jung Institute. So I called because I trust that inner wisdom. And I called and said, what do I do to become a Jungian? And they told me to go get a master's degree in clinical psychology. So I did, which was clearly the right path for me because it helped make sense, not only of my life, but of life in general. And it took a lot of years of training and a lot of years of learning, and I'm still learning, always learning. Mm-hmm. And so the call to be a therapist was really that of the call of the wounded healer, that I really did have a wound inside me that I knew of very clearly, but that I wasn't mature enough or wise enough to truly face down what the material I was being pushed by. It was like way inside me, pushing me, and I was trying to outrun it. Mm-hmm. And we're not really good at outrunning trauma. Mm-hmm. And I feel like right now in the zeitgeist, a lot of us are turning and looking back, not just at our own trauma, but at the pain of our ancestors. Now that we can understand that 4, 5, 6 generations back, we're carrying their pain too sometimes. Mm-hmm. So I trust that this is the universe's wish for me to bring this forward mm-hmm. in this lifetime.
Yeah. Trauma is for sure it's a cut and dry because it's like that you've experienced something that is affecting you, but it's also very complex. So on one hand, trauma is, we understand that it's something that has affected us negatively, but then on the other hand, getting to the bottom of it or jumping into it and exploring it is difficult. And yes. You said something that has come up here a lot, and I love the initiative behind this, but I'm big on storytelling. I think that you're big on having this story and healing through doing work in others. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that experience has been like as far as like you had this hurt, you had childhood trauma, you had trauma throughout your life. And I do want to get into what that trauma actually is, if you're comfortable sharing with us. But I also am curious, because I'm of the belief that you heal by healing others. And you've alluded to that. So can you talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Sure. Well, when I was about 5 years into my practice, I wanted to paint, and I'm a terrible painter, but I was painting these little cookie cutter figures full of red paint, and they'd be bright red at the bottom of the canvas. And as I moved the cookie cutter up the scene, it became more and more faint, as if it were disappearing into the ceiling. And underneath it, I wrote, "Somebody yelled and I went away." And in the treating of trauma, I treated a number of people who reported when a stepfather or an uncle or a brother would come in to molest them, they would go up on the ceiling and watch. And I thought I was painting this painting for them. And then a couple of years later, I was on Kauai for basically celebrating a really happy time. And I was in a hurricane, a Category 4 hurricane, on an island that you could not get off of.
Mm.
So it was kind of a metaphorical version of something coming at me, and I had no way to get away from it. And within that night, you could still hear the winds after the hurricane had passed. I had a nightmare of being held hostage and dragged from bank to bank with this very handsome bank robber who was threatening to kill me in order to steal money. So when I got back to the mainland, I went for therapy because I was having nightmares almost nightly. And I went for hypnotherapy. And in the very first session, dear old John Hedenberg took me into a trance. And I went looking for the hurricane, for the wall, where that slamming of the wall into the hurricane, where I screamed a scream that I didn't even know I had in my body. And instead of finding a hurricane, what I found was I was inside a baby's body on a changing table with my father screaming at me. And so that afternoon, I got to the office. I called my mom and said, "Mommy, this is going to be the weirdest question I've ever asked you." And I peppered her with many questions through my graduate studies because we're understanding our own development so that we can work with others. I said, "Did Daddy ever yell at me on the changing table?" There's this long pause. And then she said, "How could you know that?" And then very slowly, over about 10 years, because my sisters would accuse me of making Mommy cry when I would ask her questions about my infancy. But when I was 6 weeks old, my mom got severe mastitis and couldn't breastfeed me any longer. And my father was I was the firstborn. He was clueless. He didn't know what he was doing. God bless him. But he was heating up the only milk in the house while chain smoking cigarettes. And he spilled ashes in the only milk in the house. So while I'm crying in hunger, my mother has a high fever and refuses to be hospitalized. My dad had to get in the car and drive into town to buy milk. And I theorized for a number of years that something inside me had died that day. Because I grew up in a very safe household with people who loved me, who couldn't understand why I was so unhappy. Like I walked around with a little cloud over my head, like a Peanuts cartoon. Why can't you be happy? You have everything we never had. You're smart, you're pretty, you're this, you're that. Why can't you be happy? And that was just the beginning of this feeling of there's something wrong with me. I'm not going to be okay. And then when I was 8 years old, I was watching a neighborhood teenager play croquet. And he was tapping the ball through the wicket like they do. And I'd never seen croquet before. So I'm just watching, fascinated. He took that mallet and turned it around like a baseball bat and hit me in the face with it.
Mm.
And tore my eyelid down onto my face. Part of me left my body and watched me run back to my mother. And it was in working through these kind of things with other people that I was eventually able to do the somatic therapy training, to come into my own body, to remember these things, and to begin to see a pattern of pain that went from the cookie cutter saying somebody yelled and I went away,
Mhm.
through many, many dreams that I've had. But it didn't stop with the croquet mallet. That started in basically a binge eating disorder that plagued me until I was 16 years old and found speed, diet pills. And by the time I was 19, I was hospitalized. And the doctor that was working on me made a mistake on my body and kind of blew me up like an infection through my whole body. And I nearly died.
Mm.
And I dreamed that I left my body at the bottom of the ocean and swam away from it. And that was that. I got out of the hospital, I got well, and I took off running. And I ran for 11 years. I did everything I could. I moved from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles. I just kept running and drinking and drugging. And anything I could do, my ego could do to keep the trauma down. I liken it to the ego doesn't know any better. It thinks it's helping, and it holds the trauma down as if it's holding an inner tube underwater. And all that psychological and spiritual energy is spent holding this down. And when I signed up for graduate school and staying sober, up came the material. And so through working with others, through listening to my own dreams, my own memories, validating them with my mother so that I know I didn't make this up. Some of my work that I do is called active imagination, where you allow your imagination to flesh out the trauma because so much of it may be completely buried way under the ocean. But eventually, with gentleness and with good listeners and a lot of breathing and yoga and good nutrition and finding out what each one of us as an individual does to block the trauma, right? I could liken it to like in The Matrix when Keanu Reeves' character has bullets coming at him and he catches them,
Mm.
right? He stops them. Rather than being destroyed by the memory, you catch it and you look at it. You catch it and you look at it. And I'm still catching little bits of it and learning from it still. But that's really the journey that I've taken to, and I wouldn't use the word that I've healed myself. I wouldn't say HEALED as in the past tense. I am healing myself.
Mhm.
That my unconscious and I have a relationship that I believe will go on for life after life after life. And there is no arrival,
Mhm.
but that we can help one another to live really good lives once we realize what it is we've been dragging behind us. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm following you 100%. And you and I align on a lot of things because I've often said these things just from, I mean, I'm definitely not a doctor. I interview a lot of people that talk to me about trauma, and I've come to the conclusion as well that it's like that visual that you gave about, holding an inner tube underwater. And then eventually it's going to explode up. Like you can push it down for so long, but eventually it's going to come up. And when it comes up, it's not going to necessarily be in the way that you know or expect or want. It's going to come up like sometimes in the most ugly ways. And
Yes.
I like to encourage all people. Like one of the reasons that I do this podcast is because I want people to know you're not alone and you're not a weirdo because you have traumatic things that's happened to you, or maybe even things that you've done to cause trauma in your life. Trauma is all different, right? So regardless, I mean, sometimes people cause their own trauma and then they struggle with guilt for years and years and years. And but eventually, if that's not dealt with, like you can only stuff it for so long. And then I think this is where triggers happen. Like then I'm triggered by something. I don't even know where that came from, but I'm mad about because you responded to me XYZ, and it's coming from this unresolved trauma. And that unresolved trauma can cause so much toxicity in your life versus dealing with it facing it, which is hard and it takes, but I would much rather deal with my trauma in a state where I realize I'm starting to deal with it than for it to come out unknowingly or uncontrolled.
Yes. Yes. That's very well said.
Yeah.
It's, we have to find safe places in which to process it. And
Mhm.
that's different for everybody. I know people, I've been in yoga class where somebody will just break down crying and not know why.
Mhm.
That the body remembers so much that that now we understand and can honor. You know, People like Levine who studied animals and how when they're traumatized, they shake it off right away, and we don't. A baby on a changing table can't shake off a trauma. A polar bear being chased by a helicopter can shake off the trauma as they run away.
Mhm.
There's beautiful videos to watch of what it's like when animals in the wild shake off a trauma. And we don't know how to do that. We just don't.
So I have a
So,
question. I'm
sure.
sorry. I don't want to interrupt you mid
No,
thought,
no,
but
no,
I'm
please.
curious. I'm curious. Like you're very intuitive. Like even as a young lady, when you were getting ready to go to school, as a to become a psychotherapist, like you still were very intuitive. Like you had these dreams. Do you think this is something that is innately inside of all of us, that sometimes we're just not tuned into that frequency? Or do you think that some of us are just more intuitive naturally than others? Or do you think it's an environmental factor of like sometimes our minds and hearts have been shaped to not believe our intuition?
Yeah. I think it's a lot of it's environmental and societal. Sensitive, introverted kids are not rewarded for being sensitive and introverted. It wasn't until the pandemic I realized that I was an introvert, and it was so nice to be quiet for a few years, because extroversion is so rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 6 years old, I was passing out hors d'oeuvres to diplomats and saying, would you care for this? You know? Um, but I do think that we can all tap into it. But dreams are something that they, people come into my office all the time and say, I had the weirdest dream. And I'll go, there's no such thing as a weird dream. It's just that dreams speak in metaphor. So what it's saying may not be what you think it's saying. And if we can get and lean into the symbolism of it and bring it alive and bring various parts of the dream alive as if they are parts of us
Mm-hmm.
and really be patient with them. I mean, I had tsunami nightmares from the age of 16, 17, 18, but especially after I almost died. And only in the last 4 years have I retrieved my 19-year-old self that I left at the bottom of the ocean. I had no access to her, none, other than intellectual. But it was through the dreaming and the dream tending that I was able to say hello to her and bring her to me. My mantra with all of my different traumatized parts is it's 2024. As far as they're concerned, it's 1950 something, it's 1960 something, 1970 something, and they don't know because they're frozen in time. Okay, one of the things we do in hypnotherapy is called age progression, where we'll take somebody who's 6 when something terrible happened, and we'll go back across a bridge to visit the 6-year-old, let her say everything she needs to say and tell all the stories she needs to tell. And then we take her by the hand with the grown-up self and walk her back across the bridge until she can step together with the adult present time self. And sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes it's like, whoa, that's too much. I'm going back into the past, and that's okay. It can be a lather, rinse, and repeat. Lather, rinse, and repeat over and over again until that 6-year-old really believes that life today can be safer.
Mm.
With me?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard other people talk about this too. And I've, I've worked with some different, uh, specialists over the years, not a lot, but, I have worked with specifically with the lady who kind of did that too, where she would have you, you would sit in a meditative state and she would take you in your imagination. But I mean, in time and space and energy, I can't wrap my mind around the complexity of that. So I don't really know what exactly is happening, but I found great value in it. And
Yeah.
I'm with you on the dream aspect as well. Like I've always known my dreams are vivid. I don't they say you dream every night. I don't remember dreams every night, but the ones I remember are extremely vivid and they're purposeful, and to the point that I am looking for what the meaning behind it, because I think they're like our subconscious speaking to us. And
Yeah.
so I'm looking for that. I had a period of time where I was dreaming of hawks, and I was seeing hawks everywhere. And I'm like, now, I know there's the law of synchronicity where, if you kind of bring it to your attention, you start to see it all the time.
Mm.
But then there's like blatant, like hawk almost flew in front of my windshield, like to the point where so I constantly am looking for things like that. And okay, what does that mean? And looking that up, like what does that mean? Or, dreams that I've had that's been profound. So I think that people, if they can tap into that and they can become aware that our subconscious is is really like a supercomputer. It is way smarter than our conscious. Like what do we you probably know, like what do we use only a small percentage of our whole brain, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing to me, and I love that this is coming up here because I think so many people don't validate their own subconscious, and they don't. We live in a culture where everything's so busy that
Yes.
people don't even take the time to really sit with their self. And
Yes.
it's disheartening, I think, because I think there's where healing begins to happen, is where you first have an awareness of the problem, then you have you make a choice. Then I'm going to fix this problem, or I'm going to go on a journey to figure out how to fix this problem, and then you start doing the work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
And the work can be so surprising when you write down your dreams.
yeah. Yeah. Surprising and so rewarding too. Since I have been on my own personal trauma journey, like overcoming the things, from my past, and overcoming the things of, that's happened over the course of my life, it's like I've found immense healing. And I'm with you that it's not healed. Like, I don't think we get to the place of healed until we're like at the end. Like, that's when hopefully we've done all the work to be healed. But the process of becoming is beautiful. And the process of, it's like I've recently just tapped into this of learning how to embrace the process. Like the process is beautiful. And I've gotten fulfillment. Like I asked you the question about your work. How was your work in being able, like how much has that healed you and being able to heal other people? And personally, it's been transformational for me to do this podcast, because I have experienced accelerated healing through this podcast. And I think that I get messages that I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I've made that kind of impact in someone's life. And I thrive on that.
Yes.
Um, yeah, because it makes it feel like your trauma is not in vain. Like the things that I went through is not just thrown away. Like this really did make me a stronger person. It really did make me a better person. And now I can turn around and give back. And in the future, I may undergo more trauma, and I may need someone else's help to help pull me out of that. Life is a
Yes.
journey, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The
So,
Buddhists call it turning poison into medicine.
yeah. And I call it turning trauma into triumph. Um,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
yeah, but it's so true. It's the same. Um, so in your line of work, are you still you're still actively practicing
Yeah. Yeah.
psychotherapy?
Yes.
Um, so take me through kind of what that looks like when a client comes to you and they're just broken and they come to see you because they're broken and they want fixed. Is this kind of how this works, or is there other ways that clients are kind of led to you?
Well, they come for all kinds of reasons, but usually they come because their friends are tired of hearing them. They're stuck. They're so depressed they're not going out of the house anymore, too anxious. And the therapist is the person who will listen without judgment, will listen without unsolicited advice giving. And what I say is I'm the holder of hope, with the acronym of hope being hold on, pain ends. That we just hold on, create a safe space in which to share whatever comes up. Everything is welcome. Nothing is left behind. And that can be so healing in terms of anxiety, because anxiety is fear of the unknown, right? We're all born with anxiety, and just normalizing anxiety instead of pathologizing it can help somebody get back to school or get back into their relationships or try and have a relationship when they recognize that I'm not defective because I'm anxious or depressed. These are natural reactions to a challenging world. Okay, I don't think we've fully yet metabolized what has happened in the last 10 or 12 years in this country. And really, with 9/11 just being a couple days ago, that we haven't really metabolized what's happened since the towers came down. That we as a nation, and this is a whole lot of what my book is about, is that when something bad would happen, they expected me to shake it off and move on, forward, successful, dazzling. And that's the American way, is that something bad happens, we blame somebody else for it, and we take off running. And in therapy, we sit still and we say, what is my part in this? Like you mentioned, am I bringing on the trauma? Because for me, trauma is like a magnet. And if one really anxious thing happens to you in the first year and a half of life where you don't have words to explain how scared you are, even if it's just that mom fell asleep and left you with a poopy diaper for 3 hours. It's that nobody did anything malicious to you. Like my dad was just clueless. He wasn't malicious. That we normalize that anxiety. And that's like loosening up like a really tight stitch. We can loosen up the threads of the story of there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, whatever that fill in the blank is. We loosen it up in therapy by acknowledging, of course you're anxious. It's scary to start high school, or it's scary to have a baby, or it's scary to have a baby and then you don't know what to do with the baby because you thought you would be better than your mother and suddenly you sound exactly like your mother. Just the different things that come up for people that they then hide. And for me, being able to hold that space, because that space was so lovingly held for me, where I'm not judging somebody who's sitting across from me. I'm fully listening and fully engaged, that they receive signals of safety. Okay, because anxiety is about I'm looking for signals of danger in intimacy, in everyday life, just going to work and being afraid your boss doesn't like you, or your friends are talking about you behind your back, or the guy ghosted you after 2 dates, whatever it is, we turn it back against ourselves. And in therapy, we're able to look at our thoughts and air our feelings. And I have a few people that have been working with me for over 20 years, not because there's something still wrong with them, but they love having the anchoring of every couple weeks. The spotlight is completely on their life, opening up, sharing deeply, and it's all for them. One of my patients called it going for a spa treatment with Valerie. because we'd gone through all of the darkness. And now it's about the amazing dream they had or an encounter they had that triggered some shame. And what was that about? I thought I was done with my shame. And whoop, more shame, And just holding that space for people can be, uh, it's a gift to me and it's a gift to them and it's service. You know, that's the thing I love about 12-step programs is people do this for free. They're not educated in how to be a psychotherapist, but they've all been through trauma and lived through it and stopped self-destructing over it to hold the space for somebody who's still self-destructing, drug addicted, alcohol dependent, food addicted, sex, love, money, all the good stuff that we can use to avoid being here in the present moment. We can't live our lives forward when we're dragging all of that stuff behind us. So I help people take a life review, especially a grief and loss life review, because so many of us, when we were kids, we had a pet that we loved or a grandma or whomever who died. And the next day there's a new puppy and there's no grief. There's just, well, we got you a new dog. Get back on the horse and keep riding, rather than acknowledging so much sadness that's now stuck underneath, held down like the inner tube. We let it come up and let it come up again. And people have said to me, because I've been trying to write this book for 30 years, friends of mine have said, when are you going to be done with that baby thing? When I talk about the inner baby. And I said, I don't know. I'll share it where it's safe to share it, or I'll share it where it'll be of service. But some of my friends just weren't quite down with hearing about my pre-verbal anxiety. And yet I can't tell you how many premature people born prematurely that I've worked with in my office another therapist who didn't get pre-verbal pain might have just glossed over it and said, wow, look at you, you're such a survivor, instead of, let's go back and visit the baby in the incubator who nobody touched for the first 3 months, right? Nobody held her or him. So holding that space, knowing my own pain, I'm hoping I'll do this work until the day they put me in the ground. There's
Do you
I'm not taxed by it.
do you work with all people, all ages?
Until the pandemic, I worked a lot with children and teens as well as adults. But since the pandemic, when I went over to working only virtually, and I started writing full time as well, I don't take new patients anymore. I only see people I've seen in the past who want to come back for deeper work or more work, and people that I'm seeing presently. And I do it all virtually, which I thought at first I was going to really dislike. But they're in their homes. And I live in Los Angeles, which is, the traffic here is soul crushing. And being able to be in their own homes while I'm in my home, where they know my dogs, there's just a different intimacy to it and a different vulnerability to it than we would have had in the office, where I'm kind of in the big chair and they're in the patient's chair.
Gotcha.
It's kind of, they're doing studies on it now, kind of levels the playing field, even though I'm pretty authentic in the room. I don't hold myself out as the expert who's there to doctor you. It's much more humanistic. But yeah, I
Do you,
only work virtually.
do you find that having worked with children and adults is I'm sure there's differences there as far as like do you find one is more receptive to the therapy than the other?
Oh yeah, kids play. So when I would play with kids, you think of the kid playing with Play-Doh. I think of the kid as Play-Doh. They haven't been baked in a kiln yet. Their brains until 25, 26 years of age are so pliable that they can just have amazing breakthroughs. I mean, I've worked with kids who found their mom passed out from a suicide attempt. I've worked with all kinds of horrible trauma in children. and had them just do incredible work with Legos, and that allowed them to just get really mad at things that they couldn't get mad at in the house. For a number of years, I did equine assisted psychotherapy. I had a horse named Bodhi, who I had for 25 years. But Bodhi and I were trained as equine therapists, and I would work with children. And when you put a kid bareback up on a horse in a round pen, they're taller than you. And every one of them, the minute they were up there, would go, "Oh, I'm bigger than you." And they would burst into song, or they would start yelling about their parents' divorce. And 6, 7, 8 sessions later, I'm getting calls from the parents going, what's going on with you and so and so? And I'll go, we're doing some amazing work. And they'll say, well, she's very comfortable expressing her anger now. And I said, well, if you had to live in 2 houses, would you be angry? Because the parents, when they divorce, they just think, oh, the kid's going over to 2 houses just fine. But in my office, the kid's not going over to 2 houses just fine. They're scared. Their ground has moved out from under them, and they can't tell their parents that because they're afraid, and they have to take care of the parent. And with me, they don't have to take care of anybody. So I love and miss working with children, but I don't think it's as good for them virtually. I think they really need to have the paper and the pens and the colored pencils and the clay and tons of Legos, just to build something together and then smash it and break it all apart and say, didn't feel good to like build that up and take it apart.
Mm.
That kind of work is just precious.
What about teenagers? Do you ever work with teenagers?
Oh yeah. They're the most anxious people I've ever met. I feel really bad for them when they get diagnosed with too much ADD, ADHD, medicated, put on antidepressants, because it's really normal to go kind of crazy as a teenager. And we've pathologized it and medicalized it to where, oh my God, I've treated so many adults who've been on Ritalin or Adderall for 15, 20 years. They've developed no executive functioning of their own where they can make a schedule and keep to it without pills. And those pills are not doing the same job they did, but it sure made them quieter in class or easier to control rather than dealing with the anxiety that a kid is feeling. I've worked with alcoholic parents who refuse to stop drinking, but they'll give their kid medication rather than deal with the anxiety that the child is facing when they can't get the attention they need because mom and dad are too busy having cocktails. So teenagers, I loved working with teenagers, getting them into college, getting them to where they're sure enough of themselves that they can go out there and be something, but honoring their trauma, which it doesn't usually happen at home because parents don't want to hear it.
Mm.
Parents oftentimes don't want to hear because it scares them, and rightly so. But that's why family therapy is so valuable, is to give the children a place where they can voice things and adults can tolerate hearing it. I think my mother gave me an incredible gift by exploring my early childhood with me the way she did. I know it was difficult for her, but we grew so close in the last 10 years of her life because we really knew each other. She said at one point, you grew up enough for me to know you, and I grew up enough for you to know me. So we really met as adults, and I wish that for every family.
What advice would you give to like a parent? Because I think parenting is probably one of the hardest jobs that I've ever
Oh,
done.
good.
um, but what advice do you have that you would give? Like, obviously, therapy I think is good on so many levels, but then you go home and you're with the child
Yes.
100% of the time.
Yeah.
So, are there things that you tell parents when they take their kids back home, like, okay, now let's foster this, let's encourage this?
Yeah. Yeah. The thing I explain to parents is a couple is like a two-legged table. A two-legged table is an unstable piece of furniture, right?
Mm.
So you have a child, and now you have a three-legged table. All of the anxiety and unexpressed stuff between the couple is now channeled into the child. Then the child gets symptoms, and we work on the child's symptoms. So I always tell parents, please work on yourselves. Look at what you're handing down to your kids or what you're not being honest with yourself about in terms of your own anxiety, your own depression. I've worked with so many moms with tremendous depression because they were so alone all day long with small children, and it affects the children. And so being honest about our own stuff so that when the child comes back into the system isn't still a wobbly table. It's one adult who's trying to become whole, another adult trying to become whole, and then the energy is unconsciously flowing and somehow infecting. People are going to hate me for saying that, infecting the child with unresolved pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. I think that's a beautiful visual that you gave there as far as how that works. I brings another question to my mind, which is how then, if you have one parent that say wants to get whole, and then you have another parent who refuses, or they're so in engulfed in their trauma, whether it be shame or guilt or um, whatever, but they're entrenched in this to the point that they just can't be whole and they refuse to get help or they deny that they even have that. What would be your advice in that scenario?
Well, I would counsel that I've seen so many people who are sure they should get a divorce. And I deeply believe that within any couplehood, if you look at your own stuff deeply and honestly enough, then you can allow somebody else to be who they are. And in allowing somebody else to be who they are, very often things change. You know, nobody is the same 5 years into a marriage as they were when you met them. As a friend of mine says, my gloves come off very slowly in layers. Every year, a different glove comes off, and dark stuff can come up between couples. But if one person is willing to do the work, I call it the tail wagging the dog. You don't have to move the whole dog. But if the tail is going, I'm spiritual enough to hold the space of this family and not try to control and not try to make the other person be who I think they should be. I mean, I've had people say, well, now that I'm a yoga teacher, if my husband's not going to come to yoga and be on a spiritual path with me, then I'm going to go find somebody else. And I always think, well, if you're spiritual enough, then don't you know how to accept somebody as part of loving them? It's really narcissistic for us to think that just because we've gotten spiritual, that everybody around us ought to be spiritual. That's not spiritual. That's ego. And so I would just say, if you're having trouble, work on yourself. Work on yourself. Use every challenge that a partner gives you as an opportunity to pause and choose differently. Because we're all in a system with each other. Any two people that live together are in a system with each other. And one person can stop that system. Like, think of it like playing tennis or pickleball, right? You lob the ball, the other person lobs it back. But if you're spiritual enough and psychologically sane enough, when they lob the ball, you watch it sail over your shoulder and go, I used to go crazy when he did that. And now I smile and say, what a great opportunity for breathing and centering. And as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, smile on the exhalation.
Yeah.
Smile every time you exhale, center your nervous system. And then the nervous system of the other person isn't spun up with, I can't believe you said that, or that's unacceptable what you did. And then the finger comes out to shake at the other person rather than going, I'm just going to pause. I'm going to choose a different path. I mean, I'm sure that in all of the work you've done, you've heard the Recovery in 5 Chapters. Can't think of the author's name right now, but it's a poem that people paraphrase all the time. Chapter 1, On my path to recovery, I'm walking down a street. There's a manhole and the cover is off, and I fall in the hole. And it takes me a really long time to get out. And I'm dirty and I'm filthy and I'm angry. Chapter 2, same street. I see the manhole, the cover's off. I throw myself in. What the heck? I'm used to it. Chapter 3, same street. I fall in the hole, but it only takes me a minute to climb back out. Chapter 4, I'm on the same street. I see the hole. I see the manhole's off, cover's off. I walk around the hole. Chapter 5, I take a different street. That's the pausing and choosing. Am I going to throw myself in this hole and ruin my family? Or am I going to walk around the hole and eventually learn to choose a different reaction when something happens?
So that is a beautiful story because, and I've never quite looked at it like that, but I do think that we all are faced with choices and decisions, taking ownership for the things that we can control and releasing the things that we can't control. So when you look at that situation and you compare the two people you were describing, and you have one that's, quote, spiritual, and the other one that's refusing, you can't control that person. So the only thing you can do is put the focus back on you. And I think that we do live in a time and in a culture where victim mentality is it's rewarded in a sense, to where it's like, oh, people love drama and people love to hear the victim mentality, and people thrive in that, and so then other people talk about the victim mentality because they get they get attention from it. And so I think that that's something that's very easy for us to fall into, is into that victim sense of. And one thing that I've had to come for my own self-growth is just that I'm not a victim. And if someone is being rotten to me, like, acknowledge the fact, that I do believe they're being rotten to me, but this gives me an opportunity to grow. This gives me an opportunity to get better. And is it the path I would have chosen? Not necessarily, but it's also, I can't control that because I'm dealing with another human being. And
Yes.
even further, if we go a layer deeper, they're dealing with their own traumas, their own childhood traumas, their own perceptions of the world, their own struggles through these traumatic things, guilt and shame and embarrassment and ego and all of the things. So I think it's something that I believe that if we can grasp, no matter what level you're on, if you're on the level of like, I'm just now trying to figure myself out, or if I'm on the level of I'm making choices for what's best for me and my family, or what's best for me, or making choices to grow myself, no matter what journey you're on, understanding trauma and understanding the effects of trauma on the human experience is important.
Yes. 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 And the layers of trauma. One of my favorite quotes, I actually have it up on my wall on a sticky note from a psychologist I learned from, said, trauma is an injury to the capacity to feel. And we have all been injured. And that makes us all the same, much more than we are different.
Mm-hmm.
None of us have had a completely safe place to feel all our feelings our whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all together rather than different from each other in that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're conditioned to believe, especially now in this day and age where social media is so huge. It's like we're conditioned to believe everybody's perfect and we're the ones that's flawed. But my goal with this podcast is just to let people know, like, hey, we are all flawed. And even if it's something that you might not consider a flaw in someone's life, their perception or their underlying trauma or the things that's happened they've never even talked about still affects them. So that empathy for other people, that, being willing to like set yourself aside and not take everything so personal, that other people have traumas they've experienced too, and maybe they're reacting with a trigger versus just personally being vindictive towards you. I mean, sometimes that happens, but I think coming to those realizations are so important as well. At least it has been in my own self growth journey. I love talking with you because I feel like you have such a first, you explain things so well. I think it's so easy to understand, and putting those visuals into place, like I know truly helps people. It helps me see exactly what you're saying. Um,
Mm.
and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing because you're obviously a very brilliant lady and you've done amazing things, I'm sure, in the lives and hearts of the people that you've worked with. If you had like kind of a final takeaway that you would leave my audience with, what what would that be?
Just to trust the process. We are all processes unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and to try and be in wonder of what presents itself rather than cringing and shutting away from it. And we can pause and open and let the prayer be as simple as, please open me to whatever is presenting itself, rather than closing down and shutting down and creating more trauma. Is how do we stay open to the present moment? And I would just urge everyone listening to try meditation.
Mm,
I've been meditating for decades and I'm still terrible at it. Just terrible. My mind runs and runs and runs, and that's normal. It's being able to observe the mind running that is what meditation is for. And I couldn't have done any of the work that I've done without being able to be the observer of me and my busy brain and all of its amazing gymnastics, and trying to be kind to all those different gymnasts that live in my head.
mm. I love it. That's amazing. And I'm gathering you do this purely based. I mean, like you're coming on this podcast today purely based because you have purpose and you have a vision to help people. You really have nothing to sell. You don't even take new clients.
Right. That's
So
right.
that's commendable.
Yeah. I mean, I do hope people will read my book, but my book isn't for everybody. My book is meant, coming from the 12-step background, it was two guys sitting at a kitchen table in Ohio, and one helped the other. And now millions of people have been helped because they shared their stories with each other. And mine is meant to be a story of trauma and the healing of trauma and the process of healing it and how slow and interesting it can be. So that maybe somebody's reading it will be sitting at the kitchen table with me one day and be able to go, oh, me too. Wow, I had a dream like that. Or, oh, now I'm going to remember my dreams and I'll come back and sit at the kitchen table again with you on chapter 15, you know? And so that's my wish, is that that create a normalizing of all of these anxiety and depression feelings that we have that are so much rooted in trauma.
Mm,
I just hope that more people can be helped. Not everybody can come to a therapist, and not everyone can afford a therapist,
mhm.
but we all need mental health care.
Yeah. And you're doing your part, just by coming on
Yeah.
podcasts like this, being able to express and give people little pointers of things to do. And I'll tell you just, in my own, I'm a mom and, obviously I'm human. So I do struggle with a lot of these things. I ask questions because I personally want to know. And
Yes.
so, I mean, this has been transformational for me. So I appreciate all your expertise. And I appreciate you just spending this, last hour with us, talking to us about trauma and about the importance of mental health and the importance of getting to the bottom of what really ails us, because that's where true healing begins, right? Is
Yeah.
an awareness, and then working on it, spending a lifetime working on it and getting better and finding fulfillment. So,
Yes.
Valerie,
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You've been called to do this. It's so nice that you answered the call.
oh, well, thank you, thank you. I feel led to do this for sure, and
Yeah.
I do love love what I do. And I think that, I got a message just last night. And it, that's what keeps you going, even when it gets hard. So, and I
Yes.
know you probably can relate, because I'm sure what you do is not always the easiest job, but
No,
probably very rewarding in the end.
absolutely.
Do you have anything else you'd like to share with my audience before we get off here?
No, just don't give up. Yeah.
That's perfect. Valerie, thank you so much. I appreciate having you.
Amber.
Thank you for listening to Through the Trauma podcast. If you have found value in this episode or believe in the mission behind what we are doing, please subscribe so that you never miss any future episodes. Also, be sure to check out our transformation project at transformationthroughtraumaproject.com, where we help inspirational stories get heard on a larger scale through multiple platforms. If you know someone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Until next time.